for sticking it out. This is an exciting way to end this conference on a very, very hot topic, which is AI governance and regulation. I want to thank you for having us, and I'm going to briefly allow my co-panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So Karen, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. Karen Silverman, a lawyer by training, but most recently have founded the Cantellus Group, and we advise on technology governance, broadly speaking, of which AI ethics is a piece. So lots to summarize.
Adon Katz, I'm with Credo AI, Tech Policy Advisor, previously with the World Economic Forum, and have been in academia and advocacy in law and policy and technology.
Great. Hey, everyone. Another lawyer by training. My name is Madhu. I'm a program lead at an organization called the Partnership on AI, where we have stakeholders spanning academia, technology, civil society, and we really work with our partners to identify best practices for this industry. Thanks, Keith.
Cool. And I'm Keith Soderling. I'm a commissioner in the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where our mission is to prevent discrimination in the workplace. We're the federal agency that deals with all the hot-button issues, such as the Me Too movement, pay equity, and now artificial intelligence. So let's get started on the current state of affairs. Let's start with Adon. So where are we? What is the current state of affairs of AI governance and regulation in the U.S.?
Well,
everyone. That's not broad, so.
Right. Well, everyone's saying it today, but it's coming. That's one answer, and some of it is already here. But I wanted to build off of the last conversation in regards to privacy, because I think a lot of the developments in the U.S. are following some of the similar steps that distinguish U.S. privacy from privacy in the EU. The Europeans like to say that there is no privacy in the US, but in certain contexts, like fair credit reporting or HIPAA of health information, very, very detailed and complex and forward-looking privacy. And I think that's some of what's happening in the US. So there's a lot of talk today about the EU AI Act, and it treats AI similar to, a lot more similarly like GDPR, the General Data Protection Directive, which sees data protection in more broad and abstract context. One of the things that the EU AI Act does is talk about high-risk use cases. So the development in the US has been in these high-risk use cases. The one that's on top of mind for everyone is about employment and hiring, and we are grateful for the leadership of the EEOC in doing that. But there's the FDA is working on medical devices, the Department of Transportation, autonomous vehicles, and it goes on. And I think a lot of it is very contextual. We do have, a national AI strategy that was written up about 4 or 5 years ago, which is being implemented in the AI Initiative Act as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. But some of the things to pay attention to now are in the US, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which has been proposed but has not yet passed. And some of the new laws that came under the National Defense Authorization Act, which would include the AI Transparency Act, which is most relevant to what we're talking about. But here you have when you get more granular, you get to certain laws that are being developed. For example, the New York law is being talked about a lot, which is about hiring practices in terms of there are in many different states. There's a bill in California, AB 13, and that's the Automated Decision Systems Accountability Act. There's stuff in, I looked right before now, there's stuff in about 15 states. In Colorado on consumer data, and Illinois on video interviews. And so we're getting to the contextual part, and I think that's what a lot of us are talking about in terms of some of the monitoring and explainability. And I think the law in the US actually is entering within that context too, and I think we should be prepared. I think, as a community, support the advancement of legislation, because I think that makes tangible a lot of the work that everyone is doing here and makes it real.
Thanks for that overview. Are we, and this is for everyone, are we seeing a rush to regulate certain types of AI technologies over others, or is it just more this broad stroke approach?
Yeah, please.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of policy activity, especially in the US, around regulating government use of AI or state use of AI, which is essentially what people call algorithmic decision making. So that's distinct from private use of AI. So think, states using AI to report unemployment fraud, or states using AI to, prioritize child abuse cases, or perhaps, predicting future crime. And what we know from latest research is, there's close to 40 bills, as you said, across the US, really looking at studying and, regulating government use of AI. And what we also know about these 40 proposals across these states is that many of them haven't taken off the way that people expected them to. So there has been some kind of diagnosis around why. And this kind of dovetails into the next question, so I apologize for that, which is around what are the pitfalls of policy making. But what we know about these bills that have proliferated is that it's been really difficult to identify which agency is using what AI and for what purpose. So going back to what you mentioned about New York, so in 2018, we know that the New York City Council created a task force to look at how city agencies are using AI. They surveyed about 9 agencies, I believe, and they were able to uncover 16 users. That's 16. And a lot of civil society folks on the ground think that's a huge underestimation. And that's part of what I guess we'd be talking about for the rest of the panel, which is how do you regulate something when you don't know exactly how it's being used? But yeah, I'd like to.
Yeah, or how it will be used,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and when we talk about regulation, we're talking about, I think it's very important that we're not talking about technology so much as we are talking about use cases. My personal preference is to talk about impact more than risk. I think risk has, is a kind of loaded term, and the complexity of anyone who is going to be governed, whether it's by regulation or any other way, is to look at sort of the sum total of how a technology is being deployed and the impact it has. Everything, what we do today, I think to Ian's point earlier, bears risk. And so we have to evaluate whether we're increasing it, scaling it, or improving it, right? And so if we shift and I think the EU proposed legislation, while it speaks in terms of high risk categories and high consequence applications, hasn't quite pivoted as much as I think we'll see in the US, and you start to see in some of the US proposals, where the focus tends to be more on impact, it tends to be more on outcomes, understanding that the same technology, the same data, the same teams can be used in many, many different ways.
And before we move on from government regulation, I know, having been in this unique position where I'm the one who has to be charged with regulating this, for me, learning about AI, I really had to, and I am doing it, ingraining myself in the community. There's just a lot lawmakers, legislators, and regulators don't understand. Are you seeing that as a barrier or a challenge, just that whether it's a state, city, or even the federal government, a lack of fundamental understanding what machine learning is, what natural language process? I mean, I'm just a labor and employment lawyer. I've had to study this. Yeah. But are you seeing that as a barrier across the board?
I'll tell you, I do, and I think it's one of the most important things we can do in the next 12 to 24 months is increase the public-private conversations, increase, I think this we're talking about, it's on our list of things to talk about, but building competency all the way around. And it's not just public-private, it's technical, non-technical. It's lawyers and data scientists, it's HR managers and data scientists. And it's that real interdisciplinary education that I think we all need to be engaged in. But yeah, it's a real impediment.
Let's stick with you on that. Let's move away from government and let's talk about corporations and corporate governance, which is your background. So how are corporations now managing in the lack of the federal or global regulations. How are corporations dealing with it internally, and how are they managing both the regulatory and potential ethical risks, whether it's here or globally, without having that framework done?
Yeah, I'm not going to speak on behalf of all corporations, but I think it's a really important question, right? Which is that and we've heard already this. Did I just go off? We've heard today from a lot of you and who are in corporate America, where I think the most sophisticated response is that they're developing new teams specifically to deal with this. I think the less sophisticated or the following community is trying to figure out how to take existing values, compliance and ethics, ESG, CSR, all those sorts of structures and mapping them onto this. I think the really most inventive are taking what they've learned from the employment context, from the antitrust context, where you're already operating in a space where there are some regulations, but the regulations don't nearly cover the range of circumstances you're going to confront, and you're using that same muscle group to figure out how technology is going to impact your customers, your employees, and your regulators, right? So you're operating in a pretty dynamic, pretty ill-defined regulatory space, and that's fine, right? So, but they're expecting regulation of some kinds. I'd say most people are expecting and hoping that there'll be some standardization of community, minimum community standards, basically, so that there's some broad outline of standards and expectations, but most would probably resist overly prescriptive regulation, and if I had to generalize.
So outside of federal action or class action lawsuits, which we know drive sometimes corporate compliance, and for everyone, how do we incentivize this good behavior within corporations to ethically use AI and develop governance or frameworks internally now?
Yeah. Does anybody want to?
It's okay.
Yeah, I see developments both from the work I had done at the World Economic Forum, but also how Credo sees some of the developing norms and the shaping of norms as industry standards. So when different companies who may compete with each other while avoiding antitrust regulation move forward with some standardization of the expectations, that leads towards what the law will end up adopting as referring to industry standards. So I think one way to do it is to look across industries and find consensus.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I've been in many rooms where engineers turn to me and ask me what are the metrics or what are the benchmarks, and I have no idea how to respond to that often, because that's not something that we refer to in in lawmaking, for instance, or in law and policy. So I think we can incentivize this translation, and I guess we're going to be talking about that later with respect to explainability. Yeah, that's kind of the opportunity I see. Before incentivizing compliance, I'm like, how do we incentivize this translation? Or how do we get people to talk to each other? That's perhaps the piece that I'm most excited about.
I think that's all right. I have a kind of tactical answer to that, and I think you have to look at how we enforce laws once they're passed. And to your point about litigation, I think there are things we can do to incentivize companies that take a serious effort at this, like single damages, not treble damages. You can create safe harbor. You can create manageable reporting, internal reporting and knowledge requirements that don't expose, trade secrets, but are available for inspection. There's just lots of stuff. There are lots
of that good faith
levers.
defense line of.
Yeah, and that actually, 90% of the time, that's how we operate today in other areas, right? And employment is one example. Securities compliance is another. Tax compliance, antitrust compliance. So companies know how to do this, but we need to start. The other thing that matters very much to them is an even playing field. Mm-hmm. So they want to know that if they're doing it, their competitors also do it, and it bears any cost or, in time, treasure, or personnel that everybody's sort of exposed to the same rules. So there's like a fairness.
And before we move on from corporate governance, I do want to bring up that it feels like corporations recently, in the last 5-10 years, went through all this when it comes to cybersecurity. Now cybersecurity is big ticket item at large corporations, but that occurred because of hacks and all the significant data that were stolen and all the penalties and fines and corporate damage. What can we learn from that experience that companies just went through in the last decade with cybersecurity that we can apply to AI corporate governance?
That's a whole panel by itself.
In less than a minute.
In less than a minute. That people are the key to it. That's what we learned. That the biggest, that if you get the people process right, your cybersecurity risk goes down. And you need to get it, you need to include your CTO and tech stack, but you cannot rely exclusively on your CTO and tech stack. That's not fair to them.
Do you want to say that?
Yeah, I think there's another way of going about it. The government acts not just as a regulator, but as a market actor. Most of the rules and laws that are being implemented in the US and abroad focus on government procurement. I led a project on AI procurement guidelines. If the government asks, if you want to sell to us, you got to do this, that, and the other.
Right.
That essentially becomes law, in terms of how the norms are shaped. So that's another way to incentivize by making it necessary in order to sell.
I'm going to answer the question by not really answering the question.
Like a lawyer.
Yeah. I was more interested in the norms from cybersecurity research that could be interesting for the AI research community. So by that, I mean, there's a lot of norms in cybersecurity around disclosing vulnerabilities. You are not going to put out something before you, let the deployer or the company in question know about the harm. And I'm kind of excited about how that translates to AI research, because we also know that machine learning is dual use. We know that a technique that an AI researcher comes up with could be something that can be used to, create deepfakes, for instance. So what's the norm that we can create within the research community that can, perhaps take a leaf out of the cybersecurity book to share some of these vulnerabilities before, the research gets out? Because what we also know about AI research is that the line between research and, productization is incredibly, it's probably non-existent in some cases, especially if you look at, maybe large language models, for instance. The gap between putting out a research paper at a leading conference and, perhaps deploying a model for service is increasingly kind of getting narrower. So I'm kind of curious about, what can we learn from cybersecurity research? Because they have a bunch of robust norms that could be helpful for the AI research community.
Well, let's stick with you and talk how we bridge the policy and the technical issues here. We hear so much about the black box of AI and the calls for AI to be transparent and explainable. Let me first ask you, explainable to who?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's not simple at all. So we know that there are two existing efforts in two different communities, right? So I'm thinking about the computer science community, and I'm broadly calling this the policymaking community.
Because you have to speak a different language to all the different communities.
Exactly. So within the computer science community, there's been research from my colleagues at Partnership on AI, which has found that often deployment of explainability, or what's called XAI, really serves the needs of internal stakeholders. Explainability helps model developers perhaps debug systems, but what it's less likely to do is really serve the needs of the user or the person who's impacted by the use of the model. So that's something we know about how the computer science community views it. What we also know about the policymaking community, and there's been a lot of literature on this, is that when we refer to explainability, we're really referring to justification, right? We are less interested in the causal explanation for why a particular outcome came up. We are less interested in the mathematical or architectural explanation for why something happened, but we're really interested in justifying the outcome or the decision that a model comes to. So one way to characterize it is, we know that there are these two existing efforts, but they aren't really speaking to each other. Because one's looking at kind of a technical explanation, while the rest of us are really rallying for some sort of a understanding of what evidence the system used to arrive at a decision. So long story short, Yeah, the explainability has to serve the needs of folks who are impacted by it, but there is a nomenclature, soup, if you will, that's happening right now. And these communities need to talk to each other more effectively.
Well, let me ask you all, is it possible to do that? Is it possible to design AI and implement AI in a way that allows everyone to know what their rights are and the vendor's obligation and what the recourse is for misuse? Is that possible?
I think so. I think there are ways to operationalize AI ethics. Credo AI is trying to do that. I think there's ways in which these rules are coming into the fore where it's all premised on this notion of figuring out what's going on in the system, talking about it as a black box. And so it does meet where the law all depends on figuring out what's going on inside, revealing what's inside. And I think being able to do that allows you to tailor that information for the particular purpose and the role that the person has within an organization.
But from a corporate perspective, for the people designing AI, will they do that? Will they disclose that?
Oh, I have no idea, but I mean, I think, and in certain contexts, surely, and in other contexts, probably less likely. I mean, because we still have IP regimes, we still have, trade secrets, we still have all that. But I think, but there's also an understanding that if you want, and we recently worked on the Business Roundtable principles and policy recommendations, and if you read the preamble to that, we specifically talk about this work as being an accelerator and an enabler of adoption and AI, sort of realizing the benefits and opportunities that these technologies present, right? So there's a very close relationship and tether between doing this responsibly, which includes some degrees of transparency and explainability, which I do think are different things, and I think interpretability is still a third thing. But so that's going to be in the mix. I think the risk we run is trying to act like we have one audience on the other side of the equation. So I personally am trying to get away from any of the either or kinds of thinking and framing, because it's just not going to be that simple.
Well, let's talk about more of those other resources and explain to the audience. So with the absence of a federal standard, we're starting, as you heard, you're starting to see a lot of states and municipal governments coming forward. You're also starting to see a lot of nonprofits get involved in this space, publishing best standards and raising these issues. You just heard about the Business Roundtable, but Karen, the World Economic Forum put out HR toolkit in my world, giving HR departments a checklist. Idan, I know you've been involved in this as well for a long time. Now your current employer, Credo AI, has developed software to help monitor AI for models and bias. So can you just give us all of you can just give us an overview of what's going on outside of government, what's going outside of corporations, and this non-governmental push? Will it continue to gain steam, and how much should governments and corporations start to look at those examples in the absence of not doing it themselves?
Yeah, I think a lot of, continuing what I was saying before, finding some industry standards, often through an industry association or bringing entities together that all work on similar things or different aspects or particular technologies. They're finding whatever the best practices and industry standards are in their context. And people say in the absence of regulation, as they have been today, this is going to be at the core of what the regulation is. So the substance of it is definitely already happening now.
Yeah, and I would just say that the forum also has a C-suite toolkit and a board toolkit. And the Business Roundtable principles were set up as a roadmap because, I think there was an acknowledgement that this is fundamentally a maturity model, right? And I think the other thing we can learn from cyber is that this isn't something we achieve, it's something we do, right? And that's an important lens shift that as long as we're better today than we were yesterday, we'll get, and we're on the right path and we're improving in good faith. I think just setting aside whatever regulation is, you're going to see an improvement in the landscape. And these toolkits are built with that in mind. And I know the forums stuff is pretty robust on that.
Yeah, and although I'm moderating, I do have to say from the position of having to regulate in the federal government, everyone should welcome
Yeah.
private companies, nonprofits getting involved to help to drive compliance, because everyone wants to see it work. So I think government should welcome these toolkits and programs and software with open arms in the absence of actually making a federal standard. But I do want to open it up for some questions. I know we're running tight on time, but I want to ask some final questions here. So for everyone, does the regulation and this governance of AI, do you think it's going to foster the development of robust technology, or is it going to hinder it, like we've seen in some other areas?
I think it'll foster it. I think a lot of the approach in the more conventional sense of what AI is doing is akin to sort of medieval magic, you know? And I think as we get closer to understanding how things work, I think that will actually open up monitoring how the algorithms develop over time in a way that if you aren't forced to have continuous risk monitoring, you wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, again, a non-answer here, but it really depends on the regulation in question in terms of whether that's going to help companies make robust technology. Because I'm thinking about privacy regulation. We have seen so much of that in the past decade, but we have serious questions to ask and answer about whether privacy regulation was effective in curbing some of the harms of surveillance-based business models. So I'm a bit skeptical about whether any law or a law can be a silver bullet. I think the question really is it systemic enough? Is it, if it's sticking to old ideas of, let's say property law, right? That's kind of what's happened in data privacy. It's my data. If someone takes it away from me, I'm owed something in return. That doesn't really translate well to what we're seeing happen online, where, the harms are much more networked. So yeah, short answer, depends on the regulation in question.
What she said.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before we open to questions, last questions for everyone. Give us your boldest 2022 AI regulatory predictions. What's going to happen? Is it here in the US? Is it the EU's proposal? Is something going to happen? Karen?
Hi. I'd rather answer. I think we're still boldest prediction. Boldest prediction is actually in the small g governance side, which is you're going to see more and more private entities and governments when they're using these technologies, on their own account, taking on board these principles and getting on this roadmap that I've been talking about. So I think the integration of these concepts into the design process is going to be what we see. I am way out of the business of predicting what our legislature will do. So.
Yeah, I'm going to take the bold prediction and make it into a plea, which is that technical people will get into the conversation and realize that this is being politicized. So that means all of you will start paying attention to the legislative process and the regulatory process and chime in and make it so that ignorant choices aren't made. So it's all up to you.
That's a hard one to follow, but I think the policy trend that I'm most interested in, excited about are, algorithmic audits and impact assessments. I feel like that's a hot topic. I feel like there's going to be a lot of movement in the coming years. We're seeing a lot of that happen across the pond. I mean, the other pond. And yeah, I think that's what I'm most excited about.
All right, well, I do have to echo, being in the position of a regulator, that it is true, the more you all can get involved in the process now, while it's still in its infancy, the better outcome there is. And most of these agencies have a public comment process, or you could reach out to officials. And if you get them your thoughts, we're not specialists in this area, as all of you are, but what we're going to do from Washington is going to regulate everyone in this room in one way or the other. So it's so important to participate in that process in the beginning, opposed to having to deal with regulations that come out that are impossible to comply with, which we've seen before. So that's my equal plea as well. Thank you for having us, and I think we have a couple minutes left for questions if anyone has them.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first is going back to talking about incentivizing corporate America to apply ethical AI, and also talking about industry standards. So there has been talk that absent of federal regulations, some nonprofit or academic group or industry group is going to come out with some sort of certification that we've seen in environmental or B Corporation type stuff. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's not going to happen from my agency because we don't do that. And people have been asking since the agency was founded to certify it like other agencies do. And the same at the Department of Labor, National Labor Relations. The labor agencies just don't do that. So it won't, there's no certification you can get from our agencies. I mean, I know in food products they do that as well, but I'm not sure, Karen.
Not necessarily coming from a government, body, but some
Certification.
come from
Like a United Labs or something like that, yeah. I mean, I think product safety certifications are a very tempting kind of parallel to consider, and there's probably you could borrow from it. One of the things that I go to, because I come out of the antitrust world, is back in the day, the Federal Trade Commission would give you sort of informal interpretations, right, on specific sets of regs, which were sort of broadly articulated in the first instance, and you could engage in informal communication with the government on kind of a no-names hypothetical basis, and that was actually a really important tool as that set of regs went into effect. So there are mechanisms where you could incentivize that sort of conversation. I think Singapore has a really interesting scheme where they're creating a use case catalog and database that gets kind of genericized and published so that participants in the economy can go check their practices against those practices. There are all these like tactical things that we've used in other contexts that you could encourage and incentivize the use of those tools. I think you might end up with a certification, but you'd also have this sort of informal dialogue, which could be very valuable.
I would add another layer because I think there are a lot of efforts at certification from a bunch of different bodies. I'm aware of several that I'm getting to connect with, For Humanity and Responsible AI Institute, two of the leading ones. But I think accreditation, in order to be able to distinguish between the ones that matter and the ones that are, honest efforts, but are, largely irrelevant, we need some help, and it may be from the government, to accredit the certifiers. And I think that's what's going to move things forward a lot more.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, because I can think of a variety of AI applications that don't look like standard products, right? If you're thinking about a software or a technique or a program, and given the fact that they learn on the use, a stamp of approval earlier on does not really translate to a stamp of approval later on. So I kind of hesitate. I don't think it applies across domains, but it's still an exciting development, yeah.
But I will tell you, working at an agency that has almost 1,400 federal investigators and about 400 or 500 lawyers, the more you're doing to comply with the law on the front end, the more likely it is that those investigators will use their very limited resources, because we have jurisdiction almost every single employer in the United States for the most point. So if our investigators come to a company and you have all these systems in place and you test for bias and you're trying to comply with the law, that's not the best use of their time versus someone who is intentionally violating the law for a competitive advantage. So all this is good. The more companies do on this side is a good thing and a deterrence for our investigators, and you've seen that in other contexts as well.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I did have a second question, but I'll make it quick. So talking about leveling out the playing field, with regulation. So obviously, if some regulation comes into force into a particular country, it's going to level out the playing field in that country. But what about, international playing field? And what do you think of the developments of AI legislations outside of the U.S. and how that's going to kind of change the economic innovation playing field in the AI sector?
That's a tough question.
It's a really hard question.
I think Singapore is an example of sort of the middle AI model governance framework. And I think because Singapore is a net importing technology country, complying with the law may not necessarily be the most effective, but anyone who wants to do business here, go through this, may be a good way to do that. So that's one example, but I think there is a range of norm shaping that goes from the very informal and untethered to the strict legal one.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would want to be, I think the Transatlantic Technology Committee work is super important. I think a lot of these the OECD work is very important. A lot of the bilateral initiatives are very important. One of the risks, though, is that we see this happening in GDPR, right? Which is that some of the requirements become almost overnight formulaic. Like, how many of you have done DPAs, that don't mean a thing, right? I mean, it's like you're trying really hard. But so I think we want to avoid creating gestures around this and stay in the substance as long as we can, but without, and I think that's the balance. And so that balance actually, the international conversation is a really good place to start talking about that balance because you're forced to, fundamentally.
I have an answer to that as well. Yeah, I'd be interested to see what the role of law is in kind of leveling the playing field, as you said, right? Because we know increasingly that data annotation and data labeling services are getting exported, are getting outsourced, if you will. And that does bring into question what are the additional responsibilities, for countries where a lot of the development is located. So I'd be interested in looking at law, kind of even leveling that playing field, kind of acknowledging, the human labor that goes into producing the systems that we all use here.
I think there are all sorts of creative ways in which to help shape norms. I already mentioned some of the work that had been done in the forum on government procurement. Another example is in children's toys, the Smart Toy Awards. This sort of flipped the script so that companies willingly sent as much of their information as they could in order to pass what the criteria was, which is basically ethics and governance criteria. And so that moves the entire industry because it moves towards excellence rather than minimal compliance. So I think there's all sorts of ways that it's incentivized. Won't go into it. Another panel on its own is insurance. Insurance can play the role of setting standards. If a company will be insured for something if they follow this or that protocol, then again, that becomes de facto law in a sense.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I know. Go ahead.
I was just gonna, I just appreciate your comment about stamp of approval. First of all, because I think I've testified for some laws and given testimony, and it's just really scary to hear how technology is not only not understood, but can people can just watching regulators discuss opt-in and opt-out for an hour, and just debate it. I think you mentioned how important it is for education.
Yeah.
So one of the things on incentivizing that you mentioned, we're trying to play with that. So everyone here, the survey I forgot to mention or plug, we're calling it your favorite things. So we're trying to sort of shift the normal by people highlighting leaders, toolkits, industry standards that they would like to use. And I agree with you that if you decide, what we notice when a founder decides, or an engineer decides, or PM decides to log something in a small act, a tiny act from them has huge implications, especially early on in the product cycle. If you make tiny changes, it will literally not avoid completely, but it can really keep, because finding things are laws or regulating, it's after the fact. Someone's already been harmed.
Right.
Things have already kind of gone wrong. And not that we don't need it.
Yeah,
I appreciate all that, but I just think that people in this room have that power and responsibility, to do that early on. So if you'd like to participate in the survey, or be part of that change, talk to Veronica here, and please act as they're saying, everybody in their own creative ways. I love your toy example.
yeah.
Okay, guys, we're at time. I think we've got one more question. We've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
So I just had a quick question in terms of like the role of standardization and like industry standards, because like, kind of from my experience, I think industry standards can often be only as effective as the companies complying to them sort of want them to be. Like at the end of the day,
Right.
the intent to comply has to kind of be there as well. And so I guess kind of, I'm curious thoughts on like, are you worried that like, an over-reliance on standards could end up kind of like rubber stamping a lot of potentially, harmful applications as well?
I think that's possible, but I think that there are efforts, and Credo AI focus on policy packs, bridges what those standards are with what the law is.
Right.
And so allows people to act in their industry standard sort of way, but also be ensured that what they're doing actually is related to what the law is asking of them.
I think there's always going to be a tendency, if you're talking about laws and regulations and compliance, it definitely deflates the conversation to minimum standards as opposed to strategic opportunities and maybe more aspirational standards. And so the longer we can stay in the strategic conversation and in that aspirational sort of, how do you create the arms race to excellence kind of conversation? The piece of that we didn't discuss is that you've got to get consumers to demand toys that have these features in them, and maybe pay a little more for that because, so there's a whole economic cycle that has to support that, which means everybody has a role. But my own personal preference, just me, is that we understand that ethics and compliance are a piece of this conversation, but not the entirety of the conversation. And that we continually bring it out from the dungeon where the lawyers live and out from the dungeon where the technology people live, and keep it at that C-level strategic place to start, and then, to Alka's point, move it as a cultural norm in organization. And that's public and private organizations. That's not unique to corporations.
And I think too, from a vendor perspective, for companies that are relying on outside parties to build and design their AI and paying for it, it's the same thing with, they're going to demand compliance with the law. Because under our laws at the federal employment law, the employer is liable for whatever decision the AI makes, and the vendor is not. So I think at some point that even if it's business to business, demanding compliance with the law and showing them how they are doing it, well, whether it's a self-certification or otherwise, I think that is going to be a critical part of it as well, for getting the consumer. All right, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.